In this video, I'm going to go through the anterior pituitary and talk about the hormones produced by it. And I'm also going to get into a couple more glands today. So remember last time we left off, we were talking about the hypothalamus, which is in the brain. And I told you guys that the hypothalamus produces two major hormones, and those are oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Both of those are produced in the hypothalamus, and then they get secreted into the posterior pituitary, which is where they'll be stored until they get released into the bloodstream to travel to their target organs. Now remember, oxytocin is important in producing contractions. It's also important in breastfeeding, and then ADH is important in helping us regulate water balance within the body and helping make sure that we are able to retain enough water. It also helps increase blood pressure whenever we need to do that. So again, both of those hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, and then they're stored in the posterior pituitary until they need to be released. Now, the anterior pituitary is what we call the master endocrine gland, because it produces so many different hormones and they all have very different functions. So there are 6 of the hormones here that we will go through that are produced by the anterior pituitary. So we'll talk about growth hormone. That one's obviously going to be involved in growth. We have prolactin, which is involved in production of milk in females. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are both involved in the reproductive system. Thyrotropic hormone is involved in stimulating the thyroid gland and getting it to do what it needs to do. And then adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, it's easier to call it that, is used to stimulate the adrenal gland, more specifically the adrenal cortex, which is the outer portion of the gland, which I'll get into that more later in the chapter. So let's start with, again, we have those 6 hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. Well, 2 of those hormones affect non-endocrine targets, meaning targets that are not endocrine glands. For example, growth hormone is going to target bones, especially long bones, and muscles directly, okay, to tell them how large they need to grow, essentially. And then prolactin is going to be stimulating the mammary glands of the breast for milk production, okay, specifically in females. Now, these other 4 hormones are what we call tropic hormones, which means they are going to bind to other endocrine organs and tell them what to do. Okay, so the first one is thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropic hormone. So it's pretty obvious as to what that one's going to be doing. It's going to be stimulating the thyroid gland to tell it when to produce thyroid hormone. Okay, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. This one's going to be stimulating the cortex of the adrenal gland specifically. And then follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are both going to be stimulating reproductive organs in both males and females. Okay, so all 4 of these are going to be, again, stimulating other endocrine organs to tell them what to do. So some characteristics of all of these anterior pituitary hormones. One is they are all protein in structure. So remember in the last lecture we talked about protein hormones are what we call hydrophilic. Means they're water loving, right? Which makes it very difficult for them to get through the cell membrane and into the nucleus directly. So instead, these hormones are going to work through second messenger systems, where the hormone itself is going to bind to the outside of the cell, and then you're going to have a second messenger inside of the cell, which basically causes the reaction to occur. Okay. All of these hormones are going to be regulated by hormonal stimuli. So remember we talked about 3 different types of stimulus to stimulate these glands. Hormonal stimuli are when you have hormones stimulating the production of other hormones. Okay, so hormones are going to be stimulating the production of these anterior pituitary hormones. And once we've produced enough of these anterior pituitary hormones, they are regulated through negative feedback, meaning once we've produced enough of the hormones and the glands that are receiving those hormones, tell us that they've had enough, they'll send a signal back to the anterior pituitary to let it know, all right, we're good, we got enough of this, and then you can shut down, right? And so the anterior pituitary will turn off production at that point until the hormone level starts to get too low, at which point the glands will send a signal back to the anterior pituitary to tell it, okay, we're not getting enough hormone, we need some more, and the anterior pituitary will turn back on and it'll start producing the hormone again. Okay, so all of these hormones are going to be regulated through that negative feedback mechanism. So let's start with the first one, which is growth hormone. This one's a metabolic hormone because it's involved in metabolism, essentially, and chemical reactions involved in growth. Okay, now this one's going to directly stimulate skeletal muscles and your long bones to tell them how large they need to grow. So this is the major hormone that is involved in basically directing how tall we're going to get. Okay, so it determines our final body size. Now it's also going to stimulate proteins to be built, which makes a lot of sense when you think about muscle being built, right? You need to have a lot of protein built. So it's going to cause amino acids to get linked together to build new proteins, and it's also going to help us break down fat so we can use that fat to produce energy to get larger. Now some disorders that go along with growth hormone. The first one is pituitary dwarfism. Now, you can see an example of pituitary dwarfism in this picture here. This guy on the left has pituitary dwarfism. This has resulted from having hyposecretion of growth hormone during childhood. So hyposecretion, okay? Remember, hypo means low. Hypo is low. Hyper means high amount. So if you have hyposecretion, that means you don't have enough of that hormone. You're not producing enough. Hypersecretion means you're producing too much of the hormone. Okay, so hyposecretion of growth hormone during childhood means you're not producing enough of this hormone during childhood, and so there's nothing there to tell your bones and muscles to keep growing, right? And so they stop growing at a very young age, and you maintain that small stature for the rest of your life. Now, gigantism is when you have hypersecretion of growth hormone during childhood. So in these children, their bodies are producing way too much growth hormone, and it causes them to grow very quickly, and it causes them to grow very, very tall. So this guy on the right has gigantism. He produced way too much growth hormone during childhood, and it caused him to grow extremely tall. Acromegaly is caused by hypersecretion of growth hormone during adulthood. So here they had normal production of growth hormone during childhood, so they reach about a normal height, but then during adulthood, for whatever reason, they start to have a hypersecretion of growth hormone. And so they'll start to grow a little bit taller, and a lot of the features that you'll see with acromegaly are you'll have very, very defined features in the face, a very defined jawline, typically a very large head, and sometimes large ears as well, are characteristic of acromegaly. Okay, so make sure you know the difference between those 3 disorders and associated with growth hormone. Prolactin is the next hormone. Now this one I said is involved in milk production in the female. So after the female has the baby, we know that oxytocin is important in stimulating the letdown reflex during breastfeeding, but prolactin is important in helping to stimulate milk production, period, okay, and helping that female maintain her milk production while the baby is growing. For adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, this one is going to regulate the adrenal glands. Now, your adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys. Okay, they're kind of like pyramid-shaped structures, and you have two major parts to them. You have the middle of the adrenal gland, which is called the medulla. That's more of a nervous system tissue, okay? And then you have the outer portion of the adrenal gland, which is called the cortex. Now, the cortex is essentially endocrine system tissue. It's used for production of hormones. And so that's what's going to be regulated by ACTH, is this cortex of the adrenal glands, which again sit on top of your kidneys. The next hormone is thyrotropic hormone, which is also known as thyroid stimulating hormone. You can call it either one of those names, whichever is easier for you to remember. Thyroid stimulating hormone seems to be the easiest just because it's very straightforward, right? It is a hormone that stimulates the thyroid gland and tells the thyroid gland when to start producing its hormones. Okay, so that's its major job. The next two are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, these two hormones are grouped together in a category called gonadotropic hormones. Okay, the reason they're called gonadotropic hormones is because they are tropic hormones that stimulate the gonads. Okay, gonads. In other words, the ovaries, if you're talking about a female, or the testes, if you're talking about a male. Okay, those are the gonads. Now, follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate follicle development in females in the ovaries. Okay, another word for follicles are essentially the eggs. Okay, so mature eggs are considered follicles. So follicle stimulating hormone is going to help with the production of follicles or eggs in the females within her ovaries. And then it's also going to help stimulate sperm development within the testes of the male. Okay, so sperm and eggs are essentially the sex cells. You have the egg cells in the females, sperm cells in the male. So the sex cells are stimulated to be produced by this follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. Now, the other one, luteinizing hormone, or LH, in females, its purpose is to trigger ovulation. Now, we'll talk more about ovulation in the reproductive chapter, but ovulation is important for the female to be able to release the egg once it has matured. Okay, the egg has to be released from the ovary, and then it can possibly be fertilized by a sperm cell. So luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate the release of the egg through ovulation, okay, in females. In males, luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate the production of testosterone, which is the major male hormone, okay, that is used in development of male characteristics. And we'll talk more about that one later on. All right, so moving from the anterior pituitary to the thyroid gland. Now, the thyroid gland is found down in the throat. It's found in the base of the throat, underneath the thyroid cartilage. You can see here. So here's the thyroid gland. Let me highlight it for you guys. So it is connected in the center by a structure called the isthmus. Okay, and then it has two lobes, one on either side, a right lobe and a left lobe. Now, this gland, its major purpose is to produce two hormones, and those are thyroid hormone, which is essentially a metabolic hormone, and calcitonin, which is involved in regulating blood calcium levels. Okay, so let's start with thyroid hormone. Now, thyroid hormone is your major metabolic hormone, which means it is highly involved in regulating your metabolism. The more thyroid hormone you produce, the higher your metabolism will be. The less thyroid hormone you produce, the slower your metabolism will be. Okay? So remember, metabolism is referring to all of the chemical reactions happening in your body at one time. Okay? Not just your digestive system, but every single chemical reaction together is your metabolism. So the faster your metabolism, the better you are, and the faster you are at running through those chemical reactions. The slower your metabolism, the longer it takes you to run through those chemical reactions. Okay, so essentially this hormone is going to control the rate at which you break down glucose or break down sugar in order to produce energy, okay, from that sugar. So the more of the hormone you produce, typically the faster you break down that sugar. The less hormone you produce, typically the slower you break down that sugar. This hormone is very important for growth and development due to the fact that it's so involved in the production of energy. And it's really made up of two hormones, okay? It starts out as thyroxine or T4. This is what's produced by the thyroid gland initially, and then as it travels in the bloodstream, it eventually gets converted into T3 or triiodothyronine once it reaches the tissues that it's going to bind to, okay, to target. Now, both of these precursor hormones, okay, essentially make up what we call thyroid hormone. So if you just want to remember it as thyroid hormone, that's fine too. Just make sure you know that it's the major metabolic hormone. And both of these are going to require iodine, okay, iodine. This is a element on the periodic table in order to be produced. If you do not get any iodine in your diet, you will not be able to produce these hormones efficiently, and it can cause some problems. So let's talk about some disorders associated with the thyroid gland. For one, if you are not getting enough iodine in your diet, then you cannot produce T3 or T4, those major hormones produced by the thyroid gland, and your metabolism is going to slow significantly. Your body's going to read that, and it's going to send a signal to your thyroid gland to tell it, hey, something's wrong. We're not producing enough of these hormones. And so what your thyroid gland does is it enlarges because it's trying to compensate for the lack of hormone production. So it makes itself bigger because it thinks, okay, if I make myself bigger, I'm going to be able to produce more hormone, right? And so what happens is you end up with this growth in your neck called a goiter. It looks like a big tumor, but it's just an enlarged thyroid gland. Now, in countries like America, we have iodine in tons of our food. We actually iodinize our salt, which means we add iodine to our salt. So we get plenty of it in our diet, and that helps prevent these goiters. But in some third world countries where they don't get enough iodine in their diet, these goiters can actually be pretty prevalent in those individuals. This next disorder, cretinism, is a type of dwarfism. It's different than pituitary dwarfism. This is called by hyposecretion of thyroxine. Okay, so one of those thyroid hormones. So when you're not producing enough thyroid hormone as a child, then it's going to cause you to stop growing, essentially, and you're going to stay a very small stature, okay? Now, this is a little bit different from pituitary dwarfism, so don't get those two mixed up. This is caused by a lack of this thyroid hormone, which essentially slows the metabolism so much that the person stops growing, and they remain very, very small stature, okay? So that's cretinism. That's when you have hyposecretion of thyroxine during childhood. Okay. Now, if you have hypothyroidism in adults, meaning you are not producing enough thyroid hormone as an adult, that's called myxedema. Okay, myxedema. Now here you've already reached your full size, right? So you don't have to worry about not being able to grow anymore. But if you're not producing enough thyroid hormone, it's going to cause you to not have very much energy at all, right? Because thyroid hormone is the hormone that helps us produce all of the energy that we need. So if you're not producing enough energy, you're going to get very, very tired. You're going to get very, very sluggish. You're just going to want to lay around and sleep all the time. It can also cause swelling around the eyes, cause really dark bags under the eyes. It can cause you to have a puffy face as well. Now, Graves' disease is just the opposite. Graves' disease is caused by hyperthyroidism, whereas myxedema was caused by hypothyroidism. Okay, so Graves' disease is caused by hyperthyroidism. Now, hyper, remember, means you're producing too much of a hormone. So if you're producing too much thyroid hormone, that means your metabolism is going to go up, right? You're going to increase your metabolism. And what that's going to do is it's going to cause you to have a lot of hot flashes. Your heart rate is also going to increase because you're producing all this extra energy. And you're going to lose a whole lot of weight because of that. Okay, so you will lose weight very quickly, and it can also cause one of these characteristic symptoms of Graves' disease, which is exophthalmos, which means bulging of the eyes. So it can cause the eyes to start to bulge out of their sockets. I don't know if you guys know who Missy Elliott is, but she was a singer and a rapper back in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, and she was actually diagnosed with Graves' disease. So she had hyperthyroidism. It caused her to have very rapid, drastic weight loss. Causes issues with the heart and increase in heartbeat. And she had the characteristic exophthalmos as well. She had the bulging of the eyes. Now, this next hormone is calcitonin. Okay, calcitonin is involved in regulating blood calcium levels. So what happens is when you eat a ton of calcium, say you drink a whole lot of milk or you eat a whole lot of spinach or something, and you got a ton of calcium in your diet that day. Well, you don't need to use all that calcium, right? But instead of just throwing it away, what we want to do is we want to store it. And hopefully you guys remember from Principles 1 that the place that you store that calcium is in your bones, right? So calcitonin is a hormone that is going to cause you to store calcium in your bones. It's essentially going to stimulate those osteoblasts, the cells that help build bone matrix, to produce more bone matrix so that we can store all of that extra calcium in our bone tissue. Now, this hormone is going to act in opposition to parathyroid hormone, or PTH. So these two hormones are opposites to one another. And I'll talk about parathyroid hormone in just a second. So now we get to parathyroid glands. Okay, so on the back of your thyroid gland, again, this butterfly looking gland is the thyroid gland. We have what's called the parathyroid glands. So these are these little 4 P-shaped glands. Now here it may look like they're on the front, but really these are on the posterior side. Okay, so these 4 little P-shaped glands are the parathyroid glands. They're on the posterior side of the thyroid gland. These glands are going to be producing parathyroid hormone, or PTH, whenever we do not have enough blood calcium. Okay, so if we go a long time without getting any calcium in our diet, and we need that calcium to survive, where can we get it from? We can get it from our bones. So we can break down bone matrix, release calcium from the bones, and then use it in other areas of the body. Well, this hormone, PTH, is involved in that. It's involved in helping us break down our bones to release calcium through the use of osteoclasts. So remember from Principles 1, these osteoclasts are the cells that help break down bone matrix. Okay, they break it down and they can allow it to remove calcium from the bones and enter into the bloodstream. Then our blood calcium levels go up, right? And that will help us get back to normal. Now, along with stimulating osteoclasts, this hormone will also stimulate our kidneys and our intestines to try to absorb extra calcium. So if there is even just a little tiny bit of calcium floating around, in the blood or in the diet, within our digestive system, this parathyroid hormone will also stimulate those to try to absorb as much calcium as possible. Okay, because we're starting to get a little low and we need to get that back to homeostasis. So this is just a little graphic going back through those 2 hormones. So again, whenever you start having extra calcium in your blood, right, increase in calcium, that's going to cause you to produce calcitonin, which is the hormone that causes you to store calcium in your bones, right? So all that extra calcium in the blood gets stored in the bones. Now, if you go a long time without eating any calcium and you have a decrease in calcium levels, then you have parathyroid hormone produced by these parathyroid glands will get released into the bloodstream. That will stimulate these osteoclasts to break down bone matrix, and then that will essentially increase the level of calcium in the bloodstream. And so that helps make sure that we maintain homeostasis of calcium within the blood. Okay? So I'm going to stop there for this video, and we will pick up with the adrenal glands next time. Please watch this video, and if you have any questions at the end, make sure you write them down, and you can either email them to me or ask them in class.